So welcome to the session on the Good Conversation Guide. It's a guide that we've had online a little while, but we've relaunched it recently with some new branding and some new thoughts. What I want to talk about next is that good conversations are for the whole individual. So we're talking about well-being as well as at work. So really what we want to do to start thinking about a holistic approach is to think about how are you and how are you really? Okay, so the how we're feeling thing impacts how we are on a day-to-day basis. It's impacted by internal and external factors, which is why we come back to these important conversations being holistic, not just about work. And it's really useful to be conscious of this, and it's a useful thing to share with your teams, have those conversations, and get the best out of ourselves and each other as well. Okay, so your slide's about to flip. So I've got a bit of a delay on PowerPoint at the moment. I'm hoping you in a moment should be able to see the Good Conversations Guide front page, but I can see at the moment you can only see the tree. So bear with me. It's been really slow, isn't it? So I'll talk through while we're waiting for it to move. I'll manually drag it as well and see if we can persuade it to. There we go. We're back up again, aren't we? Good. Okay. So there might be a little bit of a time lag on this, so apologies if there is. Okay, so the toolkit was developed as a response to need across the system. There's a lot of organisations out there that are smaller organisations in health and social care. We've got a lot of GP practices, we've got a lot of care homes, we've got a lot of places with a small number of employees, and they haven't necessarily got the resources to provide big stuff in HR. So it's useful for us to provide something that's free of charge and runs across the system. So it was designed to be used by a range of organisations, maybe BCSC, social care, wherever you're at. And the aim is to create something that's accessible by everyone and it's transferable across different sectors and different employers. So it's available online free of charge for anyone who wants to use it. We'll pop the link in the resources, so help yourself and please do share it with other people. So the guide is aimed to be used by people in whatever way works for them. So we encourage you to use it organically. It isn't prescription, it isn't read this whole thing, do all these things. Pick and choose what works for you. Different things may work for different managers within your organisation. And you might choose bits of it, you might want small bits of it, you might want the templates, you might not. You need to use it in line with what you've got in your organisation already. You may already have some policies, you may already have some documentation. It's for use on top of those and aside those. If you don't have those things, it's in use for instead of those. So it depends where you come from. If you're coming from a big FT, you're going to have a lot of this stuff in place already. If you're coming from a smaller care home, you're not. So just use what works for you. So in NHS GM Integrated Care Board, for example, we're going to be using this as the basis for our appraisal process. We're going to use it as a starting point for managers to learn how to speak with their teams and how we make things work for us as an organisation. So we're going to have a look at this guide, basically section by section. But don't forget that you may have your own PDR and appraisals process in your organisation, and this is really to exist to sit alongside and support these, to add that value and depth to these policies. It's aimed to be a helpful tool. It's not a burden. It's not a barrier. Use it as you need to on a very personal level. And the first section of the guide looks at how to do this. It covers the what, the when, and the how. So encourage you to absolutely have a look at the guide in more detail online. Again, we'll share the link. But I just wanted to pick out some of the highlights of what a good conversation should be. So we talk about in the guide about how a good conversation should be meaningful. It should be something that's relevant. It's not a tick box exercise that we then forget and discard. It actually means something to both parties and it impacts your job and how you are and so on. It should be holistic. Like we mentioned before, it looks at the person as a whole. It looks at their well-being, their development, their successes, their areas for improvement. It's not just focusing on, have you done this piece of work? It should be ongoing. You should be able to build on it and reflect on it. It should be running through key themes and progress and objectives and stuff like that. It should be regular. This is flexible and it's going to depend on your working relationship and a whole bunch of different things. But it should be used alongside one-to-ones and supervisions in an appropriate frequency. And you should be able to join these conversations up. And it will vary depending on the role someone's in and how long they've been there and a whole bunch of different things. You know, you might have more catch-ups with someone who's new, for example. So your one-to-ones, they're much more regular, potentially weekly or monthly, and that would include a catch-up, an update, some wellbeing touch points, some support, reviews, some challenges, feedback actions, all this kind of stuff. I know I'm reading off lots of stuff here, but it's all in the guide. You can go back online and find it all. And then quarterly, the one-to-ones will feed into that. That's a bit more in depth. There's maybe some themes, a bit more of a review, a bit more talking about development, looking at the next 3 months, achievements, that kind of stuff. And then that feeds into the annual stuff, which is looking more against the progress against objectives and priorities, development opportunities. You're looking at training and pay progression, if that's appropriate, all those kind of things. So they all kind of feed into one another and form that circle. And then it should also be comfortable. It needs to be something that's convenient. It's not time pressure. Don't do it half an hour before you're going to finish for the day. You need to think carefully about venue, what works for both of you. If one of you's just driven for an hour to get there and the other one's only driven 5 minutes, that maybe isn't going to land well. Does it need to be face-to-face if you're working remotely? What works for you and your team member as well? It needs to be planned. We're going to have a chat about that in a minute. Look at some of the resources we've got there. Consider what both of you need from the conversation. Reflect on the previous conversation. Where do you want to go with this conversation? What do you need to get from this conversation? Don't make it a last-minute thing. And it should be documented. We don't want to create reams of information that no one's ever going to refer to, but we do need to have something there. There's templates provided in the links and in the guide for you to use as appropriate for you to use. Different organisations may have those already. You can maybe adapt some, you can maybe adopt some, do what works for you individually. But do check what your employer uses. Don't start using this stuff and then find there's a policy you should have been following. But keep some kind of record without it becoming a big chore itself. Something that's meaningful, relevant, all those things. Okay, so the second section of the guide includes the sections you can see on the screen. That's the front page of it. It's about conversation themes. So there's a lot more detail in the guide, but just in summary, just a bit of an idea of what's in there. So well-being, we look at work-life balance, what helps you to stay well. Development, what's helped you to do your job well, and how do you want to grow? Achievements, what are you proud of? What do you want to achieve? And challenges, what have they been and how have you worked through them? So they're all very personal, these things. They're all kind of set ideas of what's there, but they're all very pertinent to the individual. And then looking again about role, what's important to somebody and how would someone describe working with them? What about values? What's important to them and how does it fit in with the team and the role and the organisation? Talking about flexible working, how is it working for someone at the moment? Do they need any support? And there's also a flexible working conversation tool that's linked in there as well with a lot more detail if that's something you want to go into and a bit more information as to what works for people and linking into policies and things. Compassion and inclusion. Do people feel valued? Do they feel included? Do they need any support in that area? And then feedback. It's that talking and listening thing, isn't it? What sort of feedback have they received? Have they received any recognition? Have they got any ideas, concerns? What kind of difference do they feel that they've made? So all in all, that kind of looks at a bit of a holistic approach. It's not just kind of, this is the work I've done and this is the work I'm going to do. There's much wider things there, which we've talked about in our Mentee and some of that feedback. There's lots to uncover there. It's all in the guide. There's a lot more information about in each of these sections just about what you can include in some of these things. And then finally about what somebody wants to achieve. What are their priorities? What are their objectives? And when are you going to review these? So there's templates for all this stuff in the resources section of the guide. We want it to be supportive and helpful, as I've said, working towards individuals and different organisations. And you pick and choose what works for you, but it gives you some ideas on where to start with things. And talking about where to start, we talked a little bit about conversation should be planned. So there's some tools in the guide included. This is one of them. Some of them are included, some are linked in, but they're there to support you or your manager. Because a good conversation is planned and it's considered in advance by both parties. This is something we've alluded to earlier and absolutely right. So this is one of the suggestions for preparing for some of these conversations. There are some 360 tools available online, but a lot of them are chargeable. So this version is a simple one we've made, which is a free way of collating feedback in advance. And it's a good way to support honesty, openness, all the things we talked about, and get a wider perspective across a range of areas as well. So it's a tool you can use. You don't have to use it. It's there if you want it. It might be useful to share with some of your colleagues. There's other tools included in the guide. Again, some are in there, some are linked in, but there's plenty of information behind it. This discussion wheel is quite useful if you don't know where to start. You're not sure how to focus. Perhaps the colleague's new, perhaps you're new, and you're thinking, I kind of don't know where to begin this conversation. I'm not sure what's happened previously. Haven't got much history or feel that certain areas I'm struggling with. So you'd share it with a colleague beforehand and consider which areas you think are going better than other areas. And then you can just use and pick and choose the right tools for you at the right time. Everyone's individual, so that's why we provided a range of options to select from. Every organisation will work differently, every individual relationship will be different, and all these things here are there flexibly for you to use as and when you need to. Okay, so the next selection in the guide is support for managers. It includes a lot of detail on these main 3 sections here. There's some stuff on top tips on how to have conversations, talking about listening skills, which we've mentioned, and getting more support on that. Talks about coaching techniques, for example. Some organisations may have coaches available. For others, you could have a look online, see what resources are out there. and suggesting kind of ideas and top tips around sort of things like looking at development opportunities in advance. Kind of have those thoughts in your head about what might be coming up next, that individual. What have they identified previously, and where have we got with that? Top tips around everyone being individual. I've mentioned this a couple of times. These conversations might feel a bit standardized once there's standard documentation and stuff, but everyone has different needs. So it's remembering that although there are certain bits you may have to fill in as part of your organization, that some are more relevant to others, and some you might want to spend more time on, some less time, and to take that on an individual approach. Feeling safe, there's a section on creating psychological safety. How can you create that environment to help people feel the ability to be open and honest? That's a really important one. There's quite a lot of information in there to help you unpack that a bit. And then finally, well-being, which should be at the heart of a good conversation. And it helps people to be at their well-being, to be at their best, both at work and at home, if they're feeling comfortable in the workspace as well. So there's a link in there to our Wellbeing Toolkit, which is another tool that you might find quite useful. That mentions some of the things we talked about earlier around hybrid working as well. All kinds of different things in there, lots of different resources behind it, and lots of useful information for you. So again, we'll share the links and the resources for that. And again, it's one of those documents you can take as a library, pick and choose the bits you want, and use the bits that work for you. Okay, so the next section in the guide is resources, and there's a lot more than we've put on the slide here, but I've put these in here as just kind of the key things that you might find quite useful to have to hand, really, and just some key headline points, really. So the guide's got loads of resources to support what we've discussed. It's got links to templates and for logging one-to-ones. It's got quarterly reviews, annual reviews, all that kind of stuff. But these are a few links to some of the key tools you might find useful. So the link obviously to the Good Conversation Guide itself, the GM Wellbeing Quiz, which is quite useful to share with staff sometimes to have a chat about where people might want to pay a bit more attention to their wellbeing. Gives you some ideas on where to start if people aren't sure. The toolkit I've mentioned, lots of information on there, and looking after your teams in different ways, looking after mental health and wellbeing, and then the links into the tools I've just mentioned as well. There's also some other resources on our website, which is on the bottom there, the QR code as well. So again, this will all be circulated and you'll get all this information available. Okay, so we're going to be wrapping up relatively soon, and we're going to do some Q&A at the end. And what I wanted to say is that it's great that you've taken that time to look at this session, and it's really easy to go back to the business of work and forget all the stuff you've picked up and that you even had this conversation in the first place. So what I'm asking you to do is take something away from it. Pick one thing you're going to do from some of the things we've discussed. There's ideas on the slide. You might want to have a look at the guide and make that your action. And maybe put something in your diary in a week or two to remind yourself, to check in with yourself as to whether you've actually followed this up. Have you done something with it? So please do one thing, having gone away. Don't just forget about this and get on with work, but actually do something meaningful with these conversations. Have a look at the guide and make it progress and purpose for your team.